All right, ladies and gentlemen, this video is going to be real quick, probably less than 3 or 4 minutes. But the goal of this one is just to show you the fletchings in detail. Pay attention to the little tips. They actually do make a difference. And the intake of air here, really important to pay attention to the symmetry of these and get them perfect, guys. None of my fletches are standard, guys. They're all my own designs, and these are the same arrows you guys watch me. If you watch the last video, you'll watch me put these into a half-inch group, guys, consistently. Now, these were my worst arrows in that video, and once I finally dialed it in, these three were shooting perfect, except for this one was a tiny little bit off, and when I looked, the white fletching was a tiny bit bigger than the others. So now that's been trimmed, they should be perfect. This one was a tiny little bit off. I found the exact same thing. One fletching was noticeably bigger than the others, but only slightly. And this one, I noticed the red, just didn't seem to shoot quite right. One of the red fletchings was noticeably substantially bigger than the other. And I can still see from looking here, it looks a tiny little bit bigger. But you don't just want to go on a guess here. You want to be exactly perfectly precise. And the truth is, they're the same. So in the end, you don't just want to go on your first impression or a guess. No, you want to measure. You want to be real careful. You want to be real precise. And once you've dialed them in, it was the same with these ones. I found these fletchings, slightly twisted and really short triangular fletchings, work excellent at close range. But they're also decent in the wind. In fact, the bigger the fletching is, the more wind there's going to be a problem for that fletching. And the faster it rotates, the better. Well, these fletchings tend to do really well in the air, guys, despite what they might look like to your eye or what you might think. These all spin beautifully and are all geared to make themselves spin beautifully. And the trick is, the bigger the fletching, the harder it is to spin. The smaller the fletching, the easier it is to spin. The smaller the fletching, the easier it is to get past your shelf. And when you're making your shelf, that matters. Even if you're using a drop away rest, there's nothing wrong with tightening the conical of your arrows as in the ways that I've showed you. So if you haven't seen that, go check out my video on how I make my fletchings, guys, and you will see how I made each of these. These ones are really simple. I showed those in my detailed review of my Barnett 28-inch arrows. I still have two of those shafts. They still work well, but nocks are exploded, tips are gone. But the shafts themselves held up very well. And believe it or not, they're still some of my most accurate arrows. They're actually very good. I will end up probably getting more of them. It just won't be right away. I find that I'm enjoying the longer draw length, and even on my shorter bows, they just add that little bit extra power. These ones do have better penetration if you were looking for penetration of a target. But these ones are just a little more satisfying to shoot. They look a little bit better. I like the size. I like the more substantial length and feel of them in my hand. All of that. Plus, they are very accurate as well. And they're a little stiffer. And because I like higher poundage bows, that matters. Truth is, if all I shot was light bows, 25, 30 pounds, these would be great. I wouldn't care. 35 pounds, these would be just fine. But you start going anything over that, and they start really getting abused. And even these ones, I mean, I'm shooting them in certain bows that are much, much stronger than what they're probably rated for, but I wasn't given a rating on them. What I can tell you is what I've said, about 55 pounds is going to be your limit for these. You could shoot them out of a 60-pound bow. I have done so, but I noticed they flex a fair bit, and that's not the best for your accuracy. So, again, you want perfect accuracy. Absolutely everything has to be perfect. For the bows I'm shooting, these are a little too flimsy, and it's the only reason they're not as accurate on the more heavy bows. These ones are. But on the light bows, these are just as accurate as these. What impresses me is for a heavy arrow that's that stiff and that thick, they fire that well. They're actually really well made. They're nice, equal quality. I haven't seen a crack or a delam. I haven't had a tip come loose or a knock come loose. So, honestly, bang for your buck. I mean, damn, $18, guys, 6 arrows. Do the math. That's $3 an arrow versus $10 an arrow. I mean, I can see why people here have trouble competing with the manufacturers from China. And yet, these are great arrows, guys. They were absolutely worth their $30. And when you consider how much time you spend shooting, that matters. I shoot so much that those arrows are epic. because I shot them a ton. And what I should have done right away was pull the tips and epoxy them on. And it would have adjusted the weight imbalance that was there right away because the tips are too light. So that's going to be my last recommendation for these arrows. Also, even though you don't actually need the heat shrink wrap on these ones because the nock comes wider, I actually recommend you put some on, and either that or epoxy the nock, the outside of it. I know that stream's weird, but it might actually help strengthen it if you dipped it in epoxy and then shave these out just enough to fit the string. And there could be other things I could do to strengthen it, but I'm going to look at different things I can do to strengthen that plastic and it's probably going to involve some kind of a coating. And the reason is they're a bit flimsy. And so with those ones at that price, what I would like to see is the tips better attached. I mean, they don't exactly give you a shaft you can screw into here, guys. And so because they don't, and it's not hollow. Oh, wait, look at that. Now, see, this is the other thing. Because this is hollow, you could, say, unscrew a tip and put it in here. You could maybe even put an insert in here and put a screw-in tip. But you got to get the inserts for a 4.5 millimeter arrow shafts, not for the 6.2 mil arrow shafts that I have. So these inserts wouldn't fit those shafts no matter what. Now, the other one, because it's been damaged, it was not actually hollow, which is an interesting thing. I've cut this one and shaved it, and as you can see, it is hollow. It just has some material over it. What I did notice though is this one almost is noticeably stiffer than the other one. Like this one, I can barely flex when I flex it, whereas this one is actually quite flimsy, guys. In fact, it's incredibly flimsy compared to the other one. But it's like a subtle difference. It's like you kind of got to just feel it. And when I looked, I realized the actual thickness of this shaft is different than the thickness of this shaft, which means these aren't the same spine. This is a 350. This is more like a 4. So in the end, that would have an effect on how they shoot. And if the spine isn't consistent, that's a problem. But I will say this. It is much tougher to get a consistent spine when you use such a thin arrow. The consistency has to be perfect. Whereas with a thicker arrow, they really don't have to be all that consistent because the thickness is providing your stiffness. Here it's all in the quality of the carbon and the thickness. And if those aren't perfect, you're going to have a lot of variation in your arrows. So while I find there's more variation in these and they do have flimsy tips, the nocks were good enough. As long as you're not firing them out of really heavy bows, they're fine. They weren't actually technically a problem, although I would like to strengthen them. It's only so I can abuse them a little more. In the end, they were very good. And the only thing I really recommend with these is trim down your fletchings and weight your tip a little bit. And you can either add an insert or a little epoxy. And since the tips are loose anyway, I recommend epoxy. And once you've epoxied your tips in, those are great arrows. They're very reliable. They're very consistent. And even with the difference in these two spines, these are the two most accurate arrows I got out of that Barnett batch. Out of the second batch, I found all three were good. The first batch was pretty inconsistent, but the second batch, all three arrows were accurate and shot well. And until one of the shafts exploded, I was perfectly happy with that set. The first set I wasn't quite as happy with, but these will be the same thing. I was incredibly happy with this set, which doesn't necessarily follow that every set will be equal, right? So each one is individual. Try and treat them that way. Try and tune them that way. Even fletch them that way. You'll see it's worth it. And you'll come out with perfect accuracy like I have if you've done everything perfectly. But that's asking a lot, guys. Keith out.